Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Patriots History. I'm co-author of Patriots History, Larry Swikart, along with Michael Allen. And I want to remind you of my newest book, A Patriots History of Globalism, that just came out last week. It's already denting Amazon. It's already reached #1 in 3 different categories. So take a look at it. You'll find special deals at the Wild World of History, where we've combined this with Patriots History or a couple of other books and different book offer packages. They're good deals. I understand shipping's gone up a little bit. I can't help it. I've got to charge shipping, but otherwise they're still great offers, and they are, of course, all autographed. Remember also, if you're watching this, buy me a coffee. Go to the Wild World of History, look for the Buy Larry a Coffee button. Buy me a coffee. We're using all that money to turn Patriots History into a feature film followed by a whole film series. It's a little complicated, but we think it can work and be both a combination of Sound of Freedom and The Chosen. So help us out. All right. We are in chapter 8, House Dividing, probably one of the most important chapters of the whole book. Certainly one of my favorite to write. And as I've said in earlier lessons, let me review this. We are watching a political pendulum from the South, thinking that it has succeeded in protecting slavery forever, to the North thinking it has succeeded in getting rid of slavery entirely, putting it on the path to be gone. So we have just gone through, for example, the pendulum swinging north, and it did so ironically on the heels of what was viewed as a great Southern triumph, namely the Compromise of 1850. And the reason this was considered a great Southern triumph was not because they gained additional territory. They lost territory. California was admitted as a free state. Utah, Arizona, New Mexico territories were going to be admitted on the basis of popular sovereignty. And I think the Southerners knew that in all likelihood that was going to be, those were going to be free territories, free states, because Utah was already inhabited by Mormons, or some Mormons at least. And the railroads were, looking to go through there eventually. So I don't think the South really thought it could get Arizona or Utah. I think it thought New Mexico might be a possible slave state. But what made the Compromise such a seeming victory for the South was the Fugitive Slave Law. And the Fugitive Slave Law established basically a protocol by which slave chasers who were searching for runaway slaves could go into northern states and get them. And there was an incentive for them to return a slave rather than free somebody who, I got the wrong guy. There was almost double the money in returning a slave back to the South, even if they hadn't been a slave in the first place, which of course happened. But the main thing that led to discontent in the North and turned this into a Pyrrhic victory was that it required civilians to assist in the arrest and detainment of slaves to be shipped back. Now, it's one thing to allow people to just kind of walk through their life and ignore things if they want to, which most people will. Don't want to get involved. Nothing to see here, folks. Just move along. But when you require them to participate, especially in something that they deem repulsive or immoral or just distasteful you will get a backlash. You will get a revolution. They're not going to like that. And so that's what happened with the Fugitive Slave Act. Far from securing runaway slaves, it got many, many more Northerners to see what a bad system this was and to turn against slavery in its entirety. So that's where we are now. I am starting on page 286. As I mentioned many times before, I'm using the 15th anniversary edition. An earlier edition probably won't have the same page, won't line up the same way with the pages because we've added material within pages. But also, if you have something before the 10th anniversary edition, sometimes even the headers change. So this is on page 286, and the header is Southern Triumph in Kansas. So now they've just come off this big defeat with the Fugitive Slave Act being rebuked. Uncle Tom's Cabin came out and turned the North against returning fugitive slaves. So, despite smarting from the stiff resistance engendered by Uncle Tom's Cabin, Southerners in 1854 could claim victory. Despite several near riots over the Fugitive Slave Act, it remained the law of the land, and Stowe's book could not change that. Meanwhile, the South was about to receive a major windfall. An innocuous proposal to build a transcontinental railroad commanded little sectional interest. In fact, it promised to open vast new territory to slavery and to accelerate the momentum toward war. Since the 1840s, dreamers imagined railroads that would connect California with the states east of the Mississippi. Asa Whitney, a New York merchant who produced one of the first transcontinental plans in 1844, argued for a privately constructed railroad whose expenses were offset by grants of public lands. They would then sell these lands off to recoup their expenses. By 1852, the idea had attracted Stephen Douglas, the Illinois Democrat senator with presidential aspirations, who rightly saw that the transcontinental would make Chicago the trade hub of the entire middle United States, as of course it did. With little controversy, the congressional delegations from Iowa, Missouri, Illinois introduced a bill to organize a Nebraska territory, the northern part of the old Louisiana Purchase, and once again illegally erase Indian claims to the lands therein. Suddenly, the South woke up. Since the Northwest Ordinance and Missouri Compromise, the understanding was that for every free state added to the Union, there would have to be a slave state added. Now a proposal was on the table that would soon add at least one new free state. With no sectional balance, the state could be free because the proposed Nebraska territory lay north of the Missouri Compromise 36-degree 30-minute line. In order to appease and court his concerned Southern Democrat brethren, Douglas, therefore, recrafted the Nebraska Bill. The new law, the infamous Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, assuaged the South by revoking the 33-year-old 3630 Missouri Compromise line and replacing it in its restriction of slavery with popular sovereignty, a vote on slavery by the people of the territory. In one stroke of the pen, Douglas abolished a 30-year-old covenant and opened the entire Louisiana Purchase to slavery. Now, I want to say that again. He opened the entire Louisiana Purchase area, conceivably, to slavery. The voters would have to vote it in, but we've seen recently how elections can be stacked with mules and other traits, other little tricks. And we're going to see how, in the case of Kansas, the election there could be swayed to slavery. What if you were able to do that with all of the new states coming in from Louisiana Purchase, let's say from Kansas and Nebraska, although Nebraska is probably going to be free. the Dakotas, Montana, Colorado, Idaho, Wyoming, Minnesota. It wasn't about who was likely to settle there. It was about who could the South stack in there with a campaign of deliberate population of slaveholders to swing the votes. And it's possible, right? They could do it. So that's what's happening here. Although the idea seems outrageous today and was inflammatory at the time, from Stephen Douglas's narrow viewpoint, it seemed like an astute political move. Douglas reasoned that when all was said and done, the Great Plains territories would undoubtedly vote for free soil. Cotton won't grow in Nebraska. In the meantime, however, Douglas would have given the South a fresh chance at the Louisiana Territory, keeping it on his side for the upcoming presidential election. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, let's see. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, Douglas naively believed, would win him more political friends than enemies and gain his home state a Chicago railroad empire in the process. Douglas soon learned that he was horribly mistaken about the Kansas-Nebraska Act. After its passage, a contagion swept the country every bit as strong as the one sparked by Uncle Tom's Cabin. Free Soilers, now including many Northern Democrats, arose in furious protest. The Democrats shattered over Kansas, Nebraska. Meanwhile, the stunned Douglas, who had raised the whole territorial tar baby as a means to obtain a railroad and the presidency, succeeded only in fracturing his own party and starting a national crisis. The pendulum appeared now to have swung the South's way again, with the potential for new slave states in the territory Louisiana purchased, sans the Missouri Compromise line. Instead, the South soon found itself with yet another hollow victory. The ink had scarcely dried on the Kansas-Nebraska Act when Northern Democrats sustained massive defeats. Of 91 free state House seats held by Democrats in 1852, only 25 were still in the party's hands at the end of the elections, and none of the lost 66 seats were ever recovered before the war. Before the appointed Kansas territorial governor arrived, various self-defense associations and vigilante groups had sprung up in Missouri and as far away as New York. In a strategy by both sides to pack Kansas with voters who would advance the agenda of the group sponsoring them, the Massachusetts Immigrant Aid Society and others like it were established to fund settlers armed with new Sharps repeating rifles as they moved to Kansas. Families soon followed the men into the territory, a prospect that hardly diminished suspicions of pro-slavery Kansans. Images of armies of hirelings and riffraff recruited from all over the North to, quote, preach abolitionism and dig underground railroads consumed the Southern imagination. The Kansas-Nebraska Act allowed virtually any resident to vote, meaning that whichever side could insert enough voters would control the state constitutional convention. Thousands of pro-slavery men, known as border ruffians or pukes because of their affinity for hard liquor and its aftermath, crossed the border from Missouri. They were led by one of the state's senators, David Atchison, who vowed to, quote, kill every goddamned abolitionist in the district, unquote. And they elected a pro-slavery majority to the convention. Most real settlers, in fact, were largely indifferent to slavery and were more concerned with establishing legal title to their lands. Missouri had a particularly acute interest in seeing that Kansas did not become a free soil state. Starting about 100 miles above St. Louis, a massive belt of slavery stretched across the state, producing a strip in which 15% of the population or more was made up of slaves lying along more than 3/4 of the border with Kansas. If Kansas became a free soil state, it would create a free zone below a slave belt for the first time in American history. The pro-slavery legislature meeting at Lecompton enacted draconian laws, including making it a felony to even question publicly the right to have slaves. Do you see where we are today? Right? They're trying to create laws, and they have in many European nations, whereby you can be sent to jail for preaching that homosexuality is a sin and other things. For a while, they were looking at laws that would send you to jail if you said that the COVID China virus vax was either ineffective or dangerous, right? This is how they suppress free speech. Anything, you can always tell when an idea is probably pretty good because they, meaning the authorities, will usually try to suppress it. All right. Unwilling to accept what they saw as a fraudulent constitutional convention, that would be the one at Lecompton. Free soil forces held their own convention at Topeka in the fall of 1855, and they went so far as to prematurely name their own senators. Now the tragic absurdity of the House divided surely became apparent to even the most dedicated moderates. For not only was the nation split in two, but Kansas, the first test of Douglas's popular sovereignty, divided into bitterly hostile and irreconcilable camps with two constitutional conventions, two capitals, and two sets of senators. Pro-slavery and free soil forces took up arms, each viewing the government, constitution, and laws of the other as illegitimate and deceitfully gained. And if there were not already enough guns in Kansas, the Reverend Henry Ward Beecher's congregation supplied rifles in boxes marked Bibles, gaining the sobriquet Beecher's Bibles. Beecher's followers were not alone. Men in arms flowed into Kansas from north and south. Bloodshed could not be avoided. It began in the fall of 1855. Now, let me just say something right here. Not to jump too far ahead, but we're already seeing reports that the Democrats plan to not recognize President Trump's victory in the upcoming election, should he be elected, as all signs indicate right now he will be. Now, this has to stop. You have to accept the results of a loss. And Democrats did not accept the results of George W. Bush's loss, contrary to what they said. And they didn't really accept the results of the loss to George W. Bush, and they didn't really accept the loss to George W. Bush the first time under Al Gore. They took it to the Supreme Court. I'm just saying, this needs to stop. If you lose an election, you need to buckle up and do the best you can for the country, not for your own stupid political party. Anyway, let's keep going. A great deal of mythology perpetuated by pamphleteers from both sides created ominous-sounding phrases to describe the actions that, in other times, might constitute little more than disturbing the peace. For example, there was the sack of Lawrence, where in 1856 pro-slavery forces overturned some printing presses and fired a few cannonballs ineffectively at the Free States Hotel in Lawrence. Soon, however, enough real violence ensued. Bleeding Kansas became the locus of gun battles, often involving out-of-state mercenaries, while local law enforcement officials, even when they honestly attempted to maintain order, stood by helplessly, lacking sufficient numbers to make arrests or keep the peace. Half a continent away, another episode of violence occurred, but in a wholly different and unexpected context. The day before the sack of Lawrence occurred, Senator Charles Sumner delivered a major vitriolic speech entitled "The Crime Against Kansas." He's free soiler. His attacks ranged far beyond the issues of slavery in Kansas, vilifying both Stephen Douglas and Senator Andrew Butler of South Carolina in highly personal and caustic terms. Employing strong sexual imagery, Sumner referred to the rape of virgin territory, a depraved longing for new slave territory, the harlot slavery, which was the mistress of Senator Butler. No one stepped up to defend Douglas, and given his recent reception among the Southern Democrats, he probably didn't expect any champions. Butler, on the other hand, was an old man with a speech impediment, and the attacks were unfair and downright mean. Congressman Preston Brooks, a relative of Butler's and a fellow South Carolinian, thought the line of honor had been crossed. Since Sumner would not consent to a duel, Brooks determined to teach him a lesson. Marching up to the senator's seat, Brooks spoke harshly to Sumner, then proceeded to use his large cane to bash the senator repeatedly, eventually breaking the cane over Sumner's head. The attack left Sumner with such psychological damage that he couldn't function for 2 years, and according to Northern pamphleteers, Brooks had nearly killed the senator. The South labeled Brooks a hero, and, quote, Brooks' cane suddenly came into vogue. The city of Charleston presented him with a new walking stick inscribed, "Hit him again." Northerners, on the other hand, kept Sumner's seat vacant, but the real symbolism was all too well understood. If a powerful white man could be caned on the Senate floor, what chance did a black field slave have against more cruel beatings? It reinforced the abolitionists' claim that in a society that tolerated slavery anywhere, no free person's rights were safe regardless of color anywhere. While much of the nation focused on the Brooks cane, violence in Kansas escalated further when John Brown, a member of a Free Soil volunteer group in Kansas, led 7 others, including 4 of his sons, onto a vigilante-style assassination of pro-slavery men. Using broadswords, Brown's avengers hunted along Pottawomi Creek, killing and mutilating 5 men and boys in what was termed the Pottawomi Massacre. Northern propagandists, who were usually more adept than their Southern colleagues, quickly gained the high ground, going so far as to argue that Brown had not actually killed anyone. One paper claimed the murders had been the work of Comanches. Taken together, the sack of Lawrence, the caning of Senator Butler, and the Pottawomi Massacre revealed the growing power of the press to inflame, distort, and propagandize for ideological purpose, pretty much where we are today, with hoax news that does nothing but lie. It was a final irony that the institution of the partisan press, which the Jacksonians had invented to ensure the elections by gagging debate on slavery, now played a pivotal role in accelerating the coming conflict about slavery. All right, that's a good place for us to take a break. We'll pick up here next time with the demise of the Whig Party. So I'll see you guys back here on Friday.